In 2015, indie developer team Grybanser Fox launched an intense arcade-style vertical shooting game called Zenohell, featuring tough-as-nails, super-fast gameplay with very little room for error. Zenohell was a game that, at the very least, was going to challenge even veterans to the genre. But there were issues with Zenohell that didn't exactly sit well with Grybanser Fox. A lack of overall stage design, no sprite animation, variable sprite quality, very simple enemy AI, and a kind of random approach to designing the game as a whole were things that Grybanser Fox wanted to fix, and that's where Zenodyne R comes in.
Released on May 29, 2016, Zenodyne R is definitely a title that ratchets things up in pretty much every respect from the series' previous installment. Featuring a number of gameplay tweaks and additional features that can take quite a while to unlock, Zenodyne R takes a fairly novel approach to its structure. But, as we'll see, there's a pretty high barrier of entry for even intermediate players to see it all. Let's take a closer look.
There's nothing especially complicated about the way Zenodyne R plays. 8-way control, a fire button, a bomber button, and a shift that activates a secondary fire and movement mode is all there is to the controls. Players collect power-ups and bomber icons throughout each stage, which allows for a greater ease of enemy destruction and a fairly liberal use of bombs. Nothing huge.
Players start the game by selecting one of two available ships. More characters with new craft will unlock further down the line as a special kind of points, known as tech points, are obtained through normal play. More on that later. All of these ships are very different from one another with varying speed, shot coverage, and attack power. Unlocking them all can take time, too, so there's some replay value to be had.
Zenodyne R has a 6-stage structure which feels kind of like 7 when the final boss is factored in. Each stage is of a relatively decent length, with options for players to take on an easy or hard route. Opting for the harder stage not only makes the opposition more aggressive, but also activates a secondary boss at stage end. A 6+ stage set is pretty decently long, but the unlockable nature of a lot of the features will definitely inflate the times that players spend in Zenodyne R.
Given that it will take some time to unlock the additional ships in Zenodyne R, players will definitely require patience to see if there's a ship that best suits them in terms of attack style and movement. Almost all of the ships that are made available are extremely fast though, almost too fast. This means that tight corridors and clustered fire will be challenging to navigate even with what appears to be a single pixel hitbox. Meanwhile, slower ships can't seem to get out of the way of enemy fire nearly fast enough. There doesn't seem to be an especially sweet spot.
As such, the gameplay style of Zenodyne R has a very old-school kind of approach that is far removed from bullet hell style play. Enemy shots are almost always aimed at the player with a few patterns following predetermined paths to make things harder to dodge. Again, nothing we haven't seen before, but what does set Zenodyne apart is their speed. While some enemies have a more reserved shot speed, most have these tiny ultra-fast aimed bullets that are extremely difficult to see. Worse still, some enemies have variable shot speed for this same type of fire, and this speed variance can happen at random.
That's not to say the game is impossible though. There are a few tricks that we've come up with to get further unlimited credits. Namely, some sections of the game have enemies appear in ways with linear movement. Keeping in constant motion just before their fire starts allows for a decent chance of dodging aimed shots, while positioning the player's ship to get through a wide shot pattern.
And that's the main thing about Zenodyne R that will turn off a lot of players. The difficulty here is going to make a lot of players, even ones with a lot of shooting experience and definitely ones with less visual acuity, feel not only inadequate but downright hopeless. Games like Mushihime-sama Futari are hard, but even on God mode, players have a real fighting chance despite literally thousands of bullets on screen. Thankfully, tech points also unlock additional credits as well, which helps in seeing the later stages. But it's very safe to say that players ranging from novice to high intermediate will need to unlock free play to see a lot of the game to the end, and that can take quite a while.
It might sound like we're being really harsh about the whole thing, but Zenodyne R definitely has its merits. Advanced players looking for a game that holds none of its punches need look no further than Zenodyne R for a challenge that is second to none. The game's concept is very sound with decent, fun mechanics that should work in theory, but the game balance and iffy core mechanics make for a difficulty that is mainly derived from rush player movement, enemy shot speed, and panic, instead of carefully orchestrated patterns and patience. This is really the biggest grievance we have with Zenodyne R. It's just not a very accessible game for those without superhuman reflexes and the visual acuity of a freaking eagle.
Zenodyne R is sure to test the patience of a vast section of shooting game players, especially since tech points, while increased through a recent patch to make things easier to unlock extra ships, credits, and lore, will have most players playing a small section of stages many times over. It's truly frustrating that such a solid concept will likely be abandoned by most players on the basis that for hours upon hours, only the first few stages will be accessible on even many unlocked credits. Dayruna can't even surpass stage 1, and even I have a hard time not using a credit through the second stage.
There also seems to be a bit of a discrepancy between the ship's rating regarding firepower. It's very odd that a ship like the Dualizer, with a much higher power than one of the default ships known as the Fire Arrow X, doesn't kill enemies faster than the lower powered craft. Curious. It's very misleading at the very least.
While the Fire Arrow X seems to be the best ship to go with, since it has the best speeds and most powerful primary and secondary fire, it's still going to be a long hard road for anyone taking Zenodyne R on. Of course, with a fresh set of bombs with each life and many available in each stage, getting good enough to nab and extend here and there is a good way to boost a player's chances of making it further in Zenodyne R, which is where scoring comes in. Obviously, enemy destruction will get a player up there in terms of score. Almost all enemies killed by the player will also drop medals to collect for a bonus score. These medals are worth varying amounts depending on their size, with typical popcorn enemies dropping a basic tiny crest, while mini-bosses and stage-end bosses drop a huge swath of giant ones. All helpful to reach that 10 million point extend score.
Getting the huge crest is going to be the player's priority, but these huge crests from mini-bosses are sometimes super well hidden by their explosions and can be picked up before the player realizes it. We had to slow our footage down 30 times to actually see it when none had seemingly appeared at a glance. A medal count and their total value displays on screen when these mini-bosses and bosses are defeated as well, which informs players how many points they can get if they collect them all. Staying on top of a dying boss is the best way to instantly collect everything. A recently applied patch now displays the medals on top of explosions, but below enemy shots.
Stage End sees a bonus that counts the number of collected medals and remaining lives. Nothing big, but this is also where the tech points are tallied up. Obviously, the better the performance in a stage in question, the better the tech point payout. Taking the hard route and surviving with a no-miss, a perfect boss fight, and various other factors like taking out specific enemies and sub-bosses adds tech points to the total, making unlocks a bit easier to do.
There are no online leaderboards for Zenodyne R, so posting a high score for everyone to see is dependent on taking a screenshot and uploading it to a forum. This could see Zenodyne R's staying power suffer, since online score chasing is a much better tool to engage less skilled players, and a way better incentive to get better at the game, rather than multiple story endings.
The presentation of Zenodyne R is probably its strongest attribute. There's a lot to see, read, and hear in Zenodyne R, which is great, if you have the patience to outlast the intense difficulty of the game, that is.
The story of Zenodyne R is told through unlockable bits of lore as players collect more and more tech points. Unlike the previous Zenohell, which has its story bits displayed between each stage, Zenodyne R instead keeps the action going in-game with no breaks long enough for players to lose focus on how fast stuff is in-game. The story really does take a pretty big backseat to the game proper, which is totally fine.
The ship's pilots also have small bios that explain who they are and why they're fighting, along with info on their ships when selecting the player character to use. Their design is all imaginative and works pretty well. It's neat to see characters from previous Grybanser Fox titles like Zop make cameos.
Visually, Zenodyne is pretty clean, but again, it's really busy. There's definitely no time to take in the scenery or enemy designs. Regardless, it's all pretty solid in the end. Player ships now have turn animation in contrast to Zenohell, and player shots look pretty cool as well, especially by comparison to the beta version of the game in pre-release.
Easily the best part of Zenodyne R is the sound. The OST by Heavy Viper uses the same synthesis engine as the Sega Mega Drive, which is pretty awesome. The soundtrack is mostly well composed, with a couple of tracks feeling a little lackluster, but still great overall. Sound effects are clear and very retro, while voice effects for boss warnings, power-ups, and bombs have a cool radio quality style that sounds fantastic. Unlockable
lore about the entire conflict in Zenodyne R, as well as multiple endings and character epilogues, add to the replay value of the game for those with the patience to see the game through with each pilot. Of course, the best endings are only available with a 1 credit clear.
Rounding out the presentation are a number of options to balance the sound and filter the visuals, a clean UI, as well as a Tate mode for those with vertical monitor support. So, how does Zenodyne R stack up? Let's take a look. The controls in Zenodyne R are a bit too fast for their own good, while slower craft are much too slow. As a result, most players will die. A lot.
A lot of acclimation is definitely going to be needed for players to overcome these quirks.
There's no doubt that Zenodyne R is a very hard game, but it could very well be for the wrong reasons.
There was never a time when we felt comfortable with the gameplay at large, and much of the challenge felt as if it came from panic. Some players might appreciate this though.
6 decently long stages and all kinds of unlockables make for a pretty lengthy experience.
Novices and even intermediate players may lose interest in a game that seems to require an intense amount of grinding for a helping hand though. Ships and lore? Sure. Credits? Eh.
The visual design for the enemies, characters, and ships are all pretty neat in Zenodyne R.
Super fast enemy shots are often very difficult to see amidst the more chaotic sections.
Easily the best part of Zenodyne R, the OST is Mega Drive-tastic.
The sound effects and voice clips are also really well produced.
Zenodyne R doesn't innovate much in the grand scheme of things. A difficulty based primarily on insane bullet speed might appeal to some, but we're more comfortable with games that are perceived to be hard as balls, like Mushihime-sama Futari and Escaluda 2.
Building your way to a better shot at beating the game via tech points is a neat idea, but grinding to get these features feels a little on the drawn out side, especially with such a cruel combination of fast bullets and imprecise control.
It's very obvious that Zenodyne R isn't going to be for everyone. I know there will definitely be a select few that will crave the kind of chaotic gameplay that Zenodyne R serves up, and there are definitely spots where a good rhythm can be found. But just as easily as extends can be earned, your whole life stock can also be snatched away. Zenodyne R gets a 3.5 out of 5. You can get a copy of Zenodyne R on Steam for about $10 US, or as a DRM-free download on jackdarks.itch.io/Zenodyne-R for about $9 USD. Links in the description below.